Banishevsky was convicted of the 1965 brutal torture and slaying of a neighbor's child, 16-year-old Sylvia Likens. The girl was bludgeoned, scalded, tattooed, and starved by Banishevsky and her children while she lived in their home. Banishevsky was sent to prison for life.
The year was 1965. In a modest neighborhood of Indianapolis, the houses stood close together. Yards were small, picket fences faded, and neighbors greeted each other by name. On the surface, it was classic Midwestern America, the kind of place where everyone believed children were safe and families looked after one another. 16-year-old Sylvia Likens was the kind of girl who smiled easily. Not because life was perfect, it wasn't, but because she believed in hope. She was the third of 5 children born to carnival workers Lester and Betty Likens, who made their living traveling from town to town. The family was constantly moving, scraping together money, and doing their best to survive. Sylvia was responsible, well-mannered, and protective, especially of her younger sister Jenny, who wore a steel brace on her leg due to polio. Sylvia was her shield, her companion, her voice in moments of fear. The two were inseparable, a bond sealed by hardship and loyalty. But with the family always on the move, stability was rare. By the summer of 1965, Lester and Betty found themselves in a dilemma. They had an opportunity to work a carnival circuit for several months, but no place to safely keep their daughters. That's when they met Gertrude Banishevsky. Gertrude was a neighbor, a pale, chain-smoking mother of 7 children, ranging in age from toddler to teenager. She appeared calm, religious, and sympathetic. Her house was run down, but she seemed kind-hearted and willing to help. Lester and Betty offered Gertrude $20 a week to care for Sylvia and Jenny. A modest fee, but for Gertrude, who was struggling financially, it was welcome cash. She agreed. The girls moved in with her at 3850 East New York Street, a cramped 2-story house with creaky floors, peeling walls, and a strange coldness that hung in the air. It wasn't much, but Sylvia and Jenny had slept in tents and back rooms before. This would do, or so they thought. At first, things were tolerable. Sylvia helped with chores. She attended Arsenal Technical High School, made friends, and even dreamed about becoming a school teacher someday. She was polite, shy, and never caused trouble. Jenny, more reserved due to her leg, kept mostly to herself, always trailing just a few steps behind Sylvia. But inside the Banishevsky home, tension was simmering. Gertrude was not well. At 37, she looked much older. A lifetime of abuse, failed marriages, depression, and health problems had taken a toll. She was addicted to prescription drugs, prone to depression, and suffered from intense mood swings. Her 7 children were unruly, running wild, screaming, fighting. Her discipline methods were cruel, and her home was chaotic. Money was always tight, and the promised $20 a week became a sore point almost immediately. When the payment was late one week, Gertrude snapped. That day, she stormed into the girls' room holding a wooden paddle. "This is what you get when your parents forget to pay me," she said. Then she beat Sylvia hard and fast. Jenny watched, frozen with fear, as her sister cried out in confusion. It wasn't fair, it wasn't right, but it didn't end there. As days passed, the abuse became more frequent and more personal. Sylvia was targeted relentlessly. Gertrude accused her of everything being dirty, lazy, promiscuous. She called her degrading names. She spread lies to her own children, telling them Sylvia was a bad influence. It became a game, a sick, twisted game of shame and punishment. When Gertrude's daughter, Paula, accused Sylvia of flirting with boys at school, it ignited something cruel in Gertrude. She labeled Sylvia a whore, and suddenly every punishment became justified under that belief. Sylvia was forced to do demeaning chores. She was slapped across the face, denied meals, and told she was evil. All while Jenny, too afraid to speak up, watched her sister deteriorate. And still, no one intervened. Outside that house, Sylvia was quiet about what was happening. She didn't want to cause trouble. She still believed things would get better, that her parents would return soon, that the money would come, that Gertrude would calm down. But it was only getting worse. Gertrude began manipulating her own children to join in. One day, she made them all line up and slap Sylvia for telling lies. Even the younger kids joined. It was as if something in the household had cracked wide open and the darkness came rushing in. Then came the neighborhood kids. Gertrude started inviting children from the block into her home to punish Sylvia, telling them she was bad, sinful, a disgrace. Kids as young as 10 and as old as 17 took turns beating her, mocking her, even extinguishing cigarettes on her skin. Sylvia became a public scapegoat, a target of communal abuse in the middle of a neighborhood that pretended not to see. Meanwhile, Sylvia's parents, unaware of the horrors, continued working the carnival route. They wrote letters, sent what money they could, and planned to reunite with their girls in a few weeks. But by then, it would be too late. Sylvia was starving. Her body grew weaker each day. Her once bright eyes dulled with fear and exhaustion. Yet no neighbor called the police. No teacher reported the bruises. And no adult questioned why a young girl was no longer seen walking to school. Jenny, too terrified for her own safety, kept silent, watching her sister fall apart inch by inch. By the end of August, Sylvia was no longer a guest in the Banaszewski home. She was a prisoner. Gertrude started locking her in the cold, damp basement, naked and bruised, with no mattress, no food, no light. The basement would become her tomb. Sylvia Likens walked into that house with her sister, hoping for safety. Instead, she was swallowed by silence, by cruelty, and by the people she trusted to protect her. And as her parents performed tricks and smiled for crowds hundreds of miles away, their daughter was being systematically destroyed, body, mind, and soul, in a house filled with monsters. This was only the beginning. It started with slaps and name-calling. It would end with murder. At first, it was just bruises. Faint blue smudges across Sylvia's arms. A cut on her lip. The kind of marks that might suggest clumsiness. Maybe a fall. But those who looked closely would have seen the deeper truth: the way she walked, slow and careful. The way her voice trembled when she spoke, afraid to say the wrong thing. It wasn't clumsiness. It was fear. Inside Gertrude Banaszewski's home, something sinister had taken root. Sylvia was no longer treated like a guest. She was an object of scorn, a teenage girl branded as a threat, a bad influence in Gertrude's twisted perception of morality. It didn't matter that none of the accusations were true. Gertrude believed them, and she made everyone else believe them too. But it was more than belief. It was obsession. It was hate. The moment things spiraled began with a single rumor. Gertrude's daughter, Paula, jealous of Sylvia's natural beauty and slim figure, accused her of saying she was pregnant. Paula, in truth, was pregnant, the result of a secret relationship she had hidden from her mother. Sylvia had never spoken about it. But in a house ruled by paranoia, the truth didn't matter. Sylvia was accused, then judged, and then punished. Gertrude's version of punishment wasn't grounded in reason or discipline. It was rage disguised as righteousness. She declared that Sylvia needed to be taught a lesson, and that lesson would be delivered not only by her, but by anyone in the house who wished to join. The beatings intensified. Sylvia was slapped, punched, and kicked, sometimes by Gertrude, sometimes by Paula, and other times by the children. Even the younger Banaszewski kids, ages 10 and 12, began treating Sylvia like a thing, not a person. Sylvia was accused of being unclean physically and morally. Gertrude forced her to strip in front of others while she screamed that Sylvia was a whore, a liar, a disgrace to womanhood. It wasn't just violence anymore. It was humiliation. It was psychological warfare. One day, Gertrude forced Sylvia to insert a glass Coca-Cola bottle into herself while a crowd of children watched. The same children Sylvia once played hopscotch with. The horror didn't end at the hands of Gertrude's family. It expanded beyond the walls of the house. Gertrude began inviting neighborhood kids into the home, children from respectable families. They were told Sylvia had done terrible things, that she deserved to be punished, that she was a criminal in the eyes of God. So they punished her. One by one, they took turns slapping her, burning her with cigarettes and spitting on her. To them, it became a game, a test of loyalty, a way to bond with the older kids, in Gertrude herself. Sylvia had no idea why it was happening, But even worse, no idea how to make it stop. Jenny Likens, watching it all, was trapped in her own silent torment. She wanted to help. She wanted to scream. But she was terrified that if she did, she'd be next. Her disability meant she couldn't run, couldn't fight back. Every time she looked at Sylvia, she saw herself and it paralyzed her. Gertrude used that fear masterfully. Whenever Jenny cried too loudly or tried to protect her sister, she was smacked, threatened, starved. And so Jenny became a ghost, drifting silently through the house, avoiding eye contact, whispering apologies to Sylvia when no one was around. "I'm sorry," she'd say. "I'm so sorry." Eventually, Sylvia stopped going to school. She was too bruised, too frail, too broken. And Gertrude didn't want teachers or counselors asking questions. So she claimed Sylvia had run away. But inside the house, Sylvia was trapped in the basement, like a forgotten animal. She was tied up, beaten daily, denied food. If she was fed at all, it was garbage, moldy bread, spoiled leftovers from the trash. Sometimes she was made to eat it in front of the others. Sometimes she was forced to lick up her own urine from the floor as punishment for wetting herself. One of the more disturbing elements was the community silence. Neighbors heard yelling, screaming. One child who visited the house even told his mother that Sylvia was being hurt. But the adults did nothing. They dismissed it as kids playing rough or Gertrude being strict. One woman, curious about the noises, asked Gertrude if everything was okay. "Just disciplining a disobedient child," she said with a calm smile. No one pushed further. One particularly vile punishment came when Sylvia was caught, or rather accused of stealing food. Gertrude flew into a rage. She forced Sylvia to strip naked and then tied her to a basement pole. She whipped her with belts, burned her skin with matches, and instructed her children to do the same. Sylvia fainted from the pain. When she awoke, she was alone in the dark, bleeding, cold, and hungry. She tried to crawl toward the stairs. She made it halfway before collapsing. The psychological toll was now complete. Sylvia began to apologize for things she never did, just to survive. She told Gertrude she was sorry, that she would behave, that she would pray more, that she would stop being bad. But the apology only fueled Gertrude's cruelty. In her mind, Sylvia's submission was proof of guilt, proof that she was filth, and Gertrude had taken it upon herself to cleanse her through pain. By October, Sylvia's body was a roadmap of abuse. She weighed barely 80 pounds. Her skin was covered in open sores, cigarette burns, deep bruises. She had trouble speaking, difficulty standing. Her hair began to fall out from malnutrition. And yet she still tried to smile when Jenny looked at her. Still tried to offer hope. Still whispered, "It'll be over soon." But it wouldn't. Not yet. Gertrude's final campaign of torture was about to begin. Soon she would turn to something more permanent, something that would mark Sylvia forever. And it would involve not just pain, but branding. The slaps turned to beatings, the beatings turned to burns, and the burns were only the beginning. Time October rolled in, Sylvia Likens was no longer recognizable. Her hair was brittle, falling out in clumps. Her cheeks were sunken, skin pale and blotchy from infection and bruising. Her eyes, once bright and gentle, were empty. She moved slower, spoke softer, and eventually stopped speaking at all unless spoken to. She had become, in every horrifying sense of the word, a prisoner, but not hidden away in some remote forest cabin, not chained in a serial killer's basement in the middle of nowhere. Sylvia was being tortured in plain sight, surrounded by children, neighbors, teachers, mailmen, all the moving pieces of a regular American neighborhood. The world had not turned its back on her by accident. It simply chose to look away. Inside 3850 East New York Street, Gertrude Banaszewski had constructed her own kingdom of cruelty. She ruled her household with a mix of fear and manipulation. Her children didn't just obey, they participated. Paula, her oldest daughter, would strike Sylvia across the face casually, sometimes while eating breakfast, sometimes while brushing her hair. John, one of the younger boys, would punch her stomach like it was a punching bag. And the most chilling detail? The neighborhood kids still came over. Some were classmates of Sylvia, some were kids she had smiled at in passing. One by one, they came into the Banaszewski house and took turns abusing her because Gertrude said it was okay. Because Gertrude told them Sylvia was evil. Because Gertrude made it seem normal. Gertrude didn't just encourage the abuse, she orchestrated it like a stage director. She told kids what to say, when to strike, what tools to use. She would announce punishments like a teacher handing out pop quizzes. One child was told to heat a needle with a match and brand Sylvia's skin. Another was ordered to kick her down the basement stairs. This wasn't just sadism, this was control, and Gertrude relished every second of it. One of the most disturbing chapters came the day Gertrude decided Sylvia should be branded, not metaphorically, literally. She told her daughter's boyfriend, a teenager named Coy Hubbard, to carve a message into Sylvia's stomach. Using a hot needle, he etched out the words, "I'm a prostitute and proud of it." Sylvia, barely able to scream, writhed as her skin was seared and carved like leather. When it was over, she collapsed. Gertrude looked down at her and said, "Now no one will want you." That was the point. Not just to hurt Sylvia, but to destroy her completely, her body, her reputation, her sense of identity. She would be erased. By this time, Sylvia was no longer allowed upstairs. The basement became her world, concrete floor. No blankets, no light. She was given little to no food, forced to sleep in her own waste. And yet she survived. For weeks. How? Because she still believed someone would save her. There were opportunities, moments when the nightmare could have ended. A neighbor boy who came by often saw Sylvia's condition. He told his mother, who casually remarked that Gertrude's strict. She didn't call the police. A school official noticed Jenny's nervousness, the way she flinched when spoken to. They didn't follow up. Gertrude even sent Sylvia to school with black eyes and bruises, claiming she was clumsy. Teachers didn't question it. Nobody wanted to get involved. That was the unspoken law of the neighborhood. Mind your business. Even when the screams got too loud. Even when Sylvia stopped showing up. Even when kids whispered about the girl in the basement. Jenny Likens, crippled by fear, guilt, and trauma, tried to help her sister in the only way she knew how. She snuck Sylvia water when no one was looking. She whispered to her at night, promising, "I'll tell someone. I'll get help." Once Jenny tried writing a letter to her parents, but Gertrude intercepted it. That night, she was beaten. She stopped trying after that. Gertrude also forced Sylvia to write a letter herself, a fake confession. It read that Sylvia had run away, been with a gang of boys, and returned home beaten and injured. It was all a lie, a carefully crafted story designed to protect Gertrude if anyone came asking questions. But the moment Sylvia finished writing it, she looked up and asked, "Can I go home now?" Gertrude answered with a kick to the ribs. As the weeks went on, Gertrude's sadism reached new heights. She began forcing Sylvia to perform humiliating acts in front of others, licking the floor, barking like a dog, stripping naked while the children laughed. At one point, she made Sylvia eat feces. Each day blurred into the next, a cycle of torture, starvation, and dehumanization. But no one, not one single person outside that house, lifted a hand to stop it. One neighbor recalled hearing loud thuds from the basement, screams, crying. But when asked later why she didn't intervene, she said, "I just assumed Gertrude was disciplining one of her kids." Another neighbor noticed how often kids were coming and going from the Banaszewski home. It seemed odd, she admitted, but she never questioned it. The tragedy of Sylvia Likens wasn't just the brutality she endured. It was how many people could have saved her and didn't. In the final weeks, Sylvia gave up. Her letters stopped, her voice dimmed, her eyes became distant. She wasn't waiting for someone to rescue her anymore. She was just waiting for it to end. Jenny later told investigators that during those days, Sylvia would whisper one phrase over and over, "God, please just let me die." But Gertrude wasn't finished. She had one last plan for Sylvia, one final act that would break her completely. And by the time anyone realized what had happened, it would be too late. In the middle of a neighborhood, in a house full of children, a girl was being tortured to death. And the world outside? They heard the cries, but never opened the door. She had one last. By the second week of October 1965, Sylvia Likens was no longer just suffering, she was dying. Her body had become a patchwork of pain. Open wounds, cigarette burns, lacerations, deep purple bruises layered atop fading yellow ones. Her limbs were thin and bony, her ankles swollen. Her lips cracked from dehydration. Her eyes had sunk into her skull, watching the world from a hollowed, distant place where hope no longer lived. In the basement of 3850 East New York Street, Sylvia waited, not for rescue but for release. Death had become her only escape, and still, it hadn't come fast enough. Gertrude Banaszewski was determined to erase Sylvia not just physically, but spiritually, and if anyone asked questions, she wanted answers her own twisted version of the truth. So she forced Sylvia to write a fake letter, one that claimed she had run away and been abused by a group of anonymous boys before returning home. The letter was designed to explain her bruises, her emaciation, the horror written across her body. Gertrude dictated the message. Sylvia, barely able to grip the pencil, tried to write through the haze of starvation and pain. Her letters were shaky, scrawled, blood-stained, but she wrote. When it was done, she turned her head and asked in a whisper, "Can I go home now?" Gertrude's reply, a brutal kick to her ribs. That same night, Coy Hubbard, Paula Banaszewski's teenage boyfriend, returned. He had already helped carve the hateful words into Sylvia's stomach. Now he joined in another round of beatings, laughing as Sylvia slumped under the force of every blow. John Banaszewski, just 12 years old, mimicked the others. He punched, kicked, and stomped. Not because he hated Sylvia, but because cruelty had become routine. He was raised in a house where violence was validation. And so, blow after blow, the girl in the basement crumbled silently. Days passed. Sylvia could no longer stand. Her legs were swollen, her feet infected. She drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering gibberish, reciting Bible verses, calling out for her mother. Sometimes she screamed. Other times she whimpered. Once Jenny heard her whisper, "Mom, I'm going to die." Jenny, too scared to cry, held her sister's hand and whispered back, "No, you're not. I'm here. Just hold on." But even Jenny knew. They both did. Sylvia was leaving. Gertrude, sensing the end, decided to speed it along. She instructed her children to give Sylvia a final bath. But it wasn't a gesture of mercy, it was punishment disguised as cleansing. They carried Sylvia upstairs, limp and unconscious, and dumped her into scalding hot water. Sylvia screamed. Her skin, already raw, blistered and peeled from the temperature. Gertrude watched. When Sylvia collapsed again, she was dragged back to the basement naked, soaking wet, shivering violently. That would be her last time upstairs. Her last time seeing the sky. On October 25th, Gertrude decided Sylvia wasn't dying fast enough. She beat her again, ordered the children to drop her down the stairs, told them to jump on her stomach. Sylvia was now vomiting blood. Her breathing was shallow. Her eyes stared without focus. But in a brief flicker of awareness, she whispered, "Daddy, I'm sorry." She never saw her parents again. The next morning, October 26, 1965, the basement was quiet. Jenny woke to find Sylvia motionless. No moans, no shifting, just stillness. She called for help. Gertrude came down and touched Sylvia's chest. No heartbeat, no breath, just silence. Sylvia Likens was dead. At 16 years old, she died with over 150 injuries on her body. She weighed just over 80 pounds. Her fingernails were broken from clawing at the floor. Her skin bore burns, gashes, and that cruel carved message, "I'm a prostitute and proud of it." But Sylvia wasn't any of those things. She was a daughter, a sister, a child who never fought back, who never cursed anyone, who endured the unimaginable not for days but months in a home filled with laughter upstairs and screams below. Gertrude panicked. She tried to cover it up, ordered the children to prop Sylvia up, claiming she had just collapsed after returning from her imaginary escape. She called the police with the letter Sylvia had written days earlier, trying to make it all look like an accident. But this time, the plan failed. When officers arrived, they knew something was wrong. Sylvia's body was too far gone for any explanation to make sense. And then, through the chaos, a small, trembling voice broke the lie. "Jenny." She stepped forward and whispered to a detective, "If you get me out of here, I'll tell you everything." And she did. She told the truth about the beatings, the basement, the branding, the starvation. She told them about Gertrude, the kids, the neighborhood boys, the fake letter, the months of torture. For the first time, someone listened. News spread quickly. The media called it the most brutal case of child abuse in Indiana's history. The headlines were filled with horror. Girl tortured to death by caretaker. Teenager dies in basement hell. Sylvia Likens, tortured, forgotten, killed. The public couldn't believe it. How could this happen in a normal neighborhood? How could so many people know and do nothing? In the days that followed, police arrested Gertrude Banaszewski, Paula Banaszewski, Coy Hubbard, John Banaszewski, and several neighborhood kids who participated in the abuse. The basement became a crime scene. Bloodstains, burn marks, a concrete floor with scratch marks where Sylvia had tried to crawl away again and again. She had fought, even in her final days. With every bit of strength left in her, she fought. But no one fought for her. Sylvia Likens' story is not just a tragedy. It's an indictment of silence, a reminder of what happens when cruelty hides behind closed doors, and people pretend not to hear the screams. Her final days were filled with pain, but also somehow love. In her sister Jenny's quiet rebellion, in her whispered prayers, in her final words calling for the family that never came back for her. She never lost her soul. They tried to take it, but they couldn't. Because even in her suffering, Sylvia never became what they called her. She was innocent. And now, she was gone. Sylvia didn't just die. She was erased. And the ones who let it happen? They all had names, faces, and no excuse. Sylvia Likens was dead, 16 years old, bones broken, skin carved, body abandoned in the cold dirt of a basement. In the early morning of October 26, 1965, the walls of 3850 East New York Street finally fell silent. But across Indianapolis, the story had only just begun. The police report read like a horror novel. The condition of Sylvia's body was beyond comprehension. Over 150 wounds, burns, bruises, lacerations, mutilations, missing fingernails. Officers and coroners, hardened by years of crime scenes, could barely stomach what they saw. And then came Jenny's confession. The shy, limping younger sister, silent for months, finally spoke. "If you get me out of here, I'll tell you everything." And she did. Jenny Likens unraveled the nightmare. She described how Sylvia was starved, burned, beaten, and locked in the basement. How Gertrude Banaszewski, the woman entrusted to care for them, turned into a ringleader of torture. How the children were instructed to join in. How Sylvia begged for water, for mercy, for death. She named names. Gertrude Banaszewski, Paula Banaszewski, Coy Hubbard, Richard Hobbs, John Banaszewski, and the many neighborhood kids who treated abuse like a game. Each of them had played a part. Some inflicted wounds, others watched. But they were all complicit. As the arrest began, Indianapolis stood still. Headlines blared. Teen tortured to death in home of horror. 16-year-old dies from months of abuse. Family, neighbors accused in shocking murder. The public was furious. This wasn't a back alley crime or a moment of insanity. This was prolonged evil, and it happened in the middle of a neighborhood. Parents asked how it could happen without anyone stopping it. The church prayed, reporters descended, and everyone waited for justice. The trial begins. The trial of Gertrude Banisowski and her co-defendants began in 1966. The courtroom was packed. Prosecutors described Sylvia's death as the most sadistic crime ever committed in Indiana. Photos of Sylvia's injuries, her branded stomach, battered face, skeletal limbs were shown to the jury. Gasps filled the room. Jenny Likens testified. Her voice was soft, but her words were damning. She told the story no child should ever have to tell of how her sister slowly faded in front of her while no one came to help. The defense argued that Gertrude was mentally ill, a product of depression, abuse, and stress. They tried to paint her as overwhelmed, not evil, but the jury saw through it. Verdicts. In May 1966, the verdicts came down. Gertrude Banisowski, guilty of first-degree murder, sentenced to life in prison. Paula Banisowski, guilty of second-degree murder, sentenced to 21 years. Richard Hobbs, Coy Hubbard, and John Banisowski, guilty of manslaughter, sentenced to 2 to 21 years in juvenile reformatories. Many felt the sentences were far too light. How could a life stolen so cruelly be answered with just a few years? Sylvia had suffered for months. Most of her killers would serve less than 10. The city mourned, but for the Likens family, no sentence was enough. Sylvia's funeral. Sylvia's funeral was held quietly. A small white casket, simple flowers, a modest grave marker in Oak Hill Cemetery. On it, her name, Sylvia Marie Likens, our beloved daughter. January 3, 1949, October 26, 1965. No headline could describe the ache left behind. Her parents, riddled with guilt, never recovered. Jenny, scarred for life, lived every day with the memory of what she saw and what she couldn't stop. For decades, Sylvia's grave stood alone. No statue, no memorial, just a name, nearly forgotten. The aftermath. Time passed, and with it, so did justice. Incredibly, Gertrude Banisowski was paroled in 1985 after serving only 20 years. Her parole board cited good behavior and rehabilitation. The public protested. Over 40,000 letters were sent demanding she stay behind bars. But the board didn't listen. Gertrude changed her name to Nadine Van Fossen and moved to Iowa, where she lived quietly until her death in 1990 from lung cancer. Sylvia never got a second chance, but her killer did. Paula Banisowski, Sylvia's chief abuser, was also released after a short sentence. She too changed her name, moved, and lived a free life. In 2012, she was found working as a school aide in a public district under her new identity, a discovery that reignited national outrage. Coy Hubbard, John Banisowski, and Richard Hobbs were released after only a few years. They lived relatively short, troubled lives, haunted by what they'd done, though none ever fully accepted blame. Sylvia's death was not just a crime. It was a failure, a breakdown of morality, community, responsibility from neighbors, from teachers, from the justice system itself. Legacy. In 2001, long after the dust had settled, something extraordinary happened. A group of community members, led by Jenny Likens and child advocates, raised money to build a memorial to Sylvia. On June 3, 2001, a black granite stone was placed in Willard Park, near where Sylvia died. It reads, "This memorial is in memory of a young child who died a tragic death." As a result, laws changed and awareness grew. This is a commitment to ensure that no child is ever forgotten or abused. Sylvia's story began to resurface. Documentaries, books, and films were made. Awareness campaigns were launched. Child abuse reporting hotlines expanded nationwide. In Indiana, a law was passed that required school staff and neighbors to report any suspicion of abuse, a direct result of Sylvia's case. Her death became the reason others were saved. Today, Sylvia's name is spoken not in whispers, but in resolve. Advocates cite her as the face of child abuse reform. Her story is studied in criminology classes. Her case is required reading for social workers. Survivors of abuse often say they see themselves in Sylvia, not in her pain, but in her fight. Because despite everything, she never lost her humanity. Even in her final breath, she was thinking of her parents. Even when she was broken, she whispered prayers. She never lashed out, never surrendered to hate. Sylvia died with dignity, even when no one around her had any. Sylvia Likens was not just a victim. She was a child who trusted, who smiled through fear, who waited for help that never came. And in her silence, she screamed for a world to wake up.